please, you and your kids needs to come back. We know that you're angry about what happens between you and Marcus.
Please come back. We have good news for you about your father's company. I'm not interested. Let Marcus inherit everything. Please go and leave me alone.
If a woman knocks on your door 10 years after your own flesh and blood threw her out into the cold with 2 newborn babies, and that same family is now on their knees, begging her to come back and save them, would you open that door? Or would you let them feel exactly what they made you feel all those years ago? Stay with me until the very end, because what this mother decided to do will either restore your faith in family or confirm every fear you have ever had about greed. Welcome back to the channel. If you love true-to-life stories about family, betrayal, and the kind of justice that only time itself can deliver, hit that subscribe button right now, because today's story is one you will be thinking about long after it ends. This is the story of Vivian Coleman, a mother who was cast out with absolutely nothing, and the family that later needed her more than she ever needed them. Vivian Coleman grew up in a large white farmhouse on the edge of Millbrook, Georgia, a quiet town about 40 minutes outside Savannah, where pine trees stretched for miles in every direction, and everybody knew everybody else's business before they knew their own. Her father, Nathaniel Coleman, had built Coleman Lumber and Supply from a single delivery truck and a rented sawmill into one of the largest timber and hardware suppliers in the entire state of Georgia. He was a hard man in business, the kind of man who shook hands on deals and never once broke his word. But at home, underneath all that toughness, he was soft in the places that mattered, and he loved his 2 children fiercely, even if he rarely said it out loud the way some fathers do. Vivian was the younger of Nathaniel's 2 children, 6 years behind her brother Marcus, and from the time she could walk, she had been the light of that old farmhouse. She was the one who sat with her father on the wraparound porch in the evenings, while he smoked his pipe and talked about board feet and delivery routes, and which bank in Savannah was worth trusting. She was the one who remembered her mother's birthday every single year, even after her mother passed away from a long illness when Vivian was only 12 years old, leaving a hole in that house that never quite closed. Marcus, on the other hand, was ambitious in a way that made the people around him a little uneasy, even as a boy. He wanted the company. He wanted the name on the sign to feel like it belonged to him, and him alone. He wanted to be the man that people in Millbrook pointed to on Main Street and said, "Now that man built something," and he resented, quietly at first and then louder as the years went on, that his father seemed to trust Vivian's steady judgment on the family's finances more than he trusted his own son's grand ideas about expansion. Nathaniel Coleman used to say that his daughter had a head for numbers and a heart for people, and that was a rare combination in this world. He would let her sit in on meetings with the accountants, starting when she was just 16 years old, teaching her how to read a balance sheet the way other fathers taught their children how to fish. Marcus was rarely invited into those same meetings, not because his father didn't love him, but because Marcus had a habit of getting frustrated with the slow, careful pace his father insisted on, always pushing for faster growth, bigger loans, riskier expansion into new counties before the company had the cash reserves to support it. Nathaniel used to tell his old friends at the feed store that his son had the drive of 10 men, but the patience of none, and that worried him more than he ever let on. When Nathaniel Coleman passed away suddenly from a stroke at the age of 63, Vivian was 26 years old, and Marcus was 32. The will was simple enough on paper. The company, the land, the accounts, everything Nathaniel had built over 4 decades was to be split evenly between Marcus and Vivian, with one condition written in Nathaniel's own careful, deliberate handwriting on the final page of the trust document. The full inheritance, the deeds to the land, the controlling shares of the company, all of it would remain locked inside a family trust until both of his children, or their direct descendants, agreed together, in writing, on how it would be managed going forward. Nathaniel wanted his son and his daughter to need each other. He wanted them to sit at the same kitchen table where they had grown up eating supper together and make decisions as a family, the way he had always secretly dreamed they would, even as he watched the tension between them grow year after year. He never imagined, not for one single second, that this exact clause, meant to bind his children together in love and cooperation, would one day become the very weapon his son would use to try and destroy his daughter. For the first 2 years after their father's passing, things between Marcus and Vivian were tense, but manageable. Marcus took over the day-to-day operations of the company, since he had always worked alongside his father on the business side, while Vivian, who had trained formally as a bookkeeper and had inherited every ounce of her father's sharp mind for numbers, managed the accounts, the payroll, and the trust paperwork. It worked, more or less, in the careful, distant way that siblings sometimes manage to coexist when they both love the same thing but for different reasons. That fragile balance held right up until Vivian met a young man named Daniel Ross. Daniel was not from money, and he never pretended to be. He was a young mechanical engineer who had come to Millbrook to help modernize the aging equipment at the Coleman lumber sawmill, and Vivian fell for him the way people sometimes fall for someone who makes them laugh again after years of feeling like they had to be the responsible one in every room. Daniel had a way of making even the dullest afternoon feel like an adventure, and for the first time since her mother's death, Vivian felt like she was allowed to simply be young and happy, instead of the reliable Coleman daughter everyone depended on. Within a year they were engaged, planning a small spring wedding at the same church where Vivian had been baptized. Within a year and a half, Vivian was pregnant, and not with one baby, but with twins, a discovery that filled the small house she and Daniel had started renting on the edge of town with more joy than either of them knew what to do with. But 3 months before the wedding was supposed to happen, on a rainy Tuesday evening, Daniel was killed instantly in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway just outside Augusta, on his way home from visiting his own mother, who lived alone and whom he checked on every single week without fail. Vivian was left alone at 29 years old, 7 months, along with twins, grieving a man she never got the chance to marry, planning a funeral instead of a wedding, and trying to hold herself together for the 2 lives growing inside her. This is the exact moment Marcus Coleman had been waiting for, whether he ever fully admitted that truth to himself or not. In a small, gossip-hungry town like Millbrook, where the church pews and the diner counters served as the unofficial courtrooms of public opinion, an unmarried, pregnant woman carrying a dead man's children was exactly the kind of scandal that could be twisted into shame if someone wanted badly enough to twist it. And Marcus wanted to, more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. He started quietly at first, mentioning to members of the town council and the deacons at the church that his sister's condition was becoming an embarrassment to the Coleman name, that their late father would be rolling in his grave, that a woman raising twins alone, out of wedlock, was no fit representative for a company built over 4 decades on respectability and hard, honest work. None of this was really about Daniel, or about scandal, or about the church, and deep down Marcus knew it. It was about control, plain and simple, because buried in the language of their father's trust, if Vivian was deemed morally unfit or a liability to the Coleman family name, Marcus, as the eldest child, had the legal standing to petition the court for full control of the trust until any dispute could be properly resolved. And disputes, as any good lawyer will tell you, can be stretched out for years, especially when one side has all the money and the other side has none. Marcus hired the Coleman family's longtime attorney, a man named Harold Ebson, who had known Nathaniel for over 30 years and had drawn up half the contracts that built Coleman lumber into what it had become. What Vivian did not know at the time, and would not learn until years later, was that Harold owed Marcus a substantial sum of money from a private real estate deal that had gone badly wrong 2 years earlier, a debt that made Harold far more compliant than he might otherwise have been. Harold drew up the petition exactly the way Marcus wanted it. Marcus presented it to the town's small probate court with a face full of manufactured concern, claiming publicly that he only wanted to protect the company and his late father's legacy during what he called an unstable and uncertain time for the family. Vivian, 7 months pregnant, exhausted from grief, and completely blindsided, did not have the money to hire a proper attorney to fight back. She tried anyway. She drove into Savannah and sat in the waiting rooms of 2 different law firms, only to be quoted retainer fees she could never afford on her modest bookkeeper's salary, especially now that Marcus had quietly frozen her access to the family accounts, citing on paper some vague concern about irregular activity that supposedly needed to be reviewed by an independent auditor. 2 months after the twins, a boy and a girl Vivian named Ethan and Sophie were born in Savannah Memorial Hospital. Marcus came to the small guest cottage on the edge of the Coleman property, the same cottage Vivian had been staying in since the main farmhouse now technically belonged to the trust itself. He did not come with kindness in his heart, and he did not come alone. He came with two men from a moving company and a manila folder full of legal papers and a voice that Vivian would describe years later as sounding like a stranger who happened to be wearing her brother's face. He told her, standing in the small living room while the twins slept in a shared bassinet nearby, that the trust required the family name to be protected at all costs, that her current situation reflected poorly on the company and on their father's memory, and that it would be best for absolutely everyone involved if she left Millbrook altogether, quietly, without any fuss. He set an envelope on the kitchen table containing $3,000 in cash, called it a generous parting gesture, and told her, calmly, without a single raised syllable, that if she caused any trouble at all, if she tried to fight the trust in court or spoke publicly about what he was doing, he would personally make sure that every business owner in 3 counties knew exactly why the bank had frozen her credit, exactly why the church ladies had suddenly stopped inviting her to their Sunday socials, and exactly whose fault everyone would believe it truly was. He never raised his voice, not once, and that, Vivian said later, was the part that broke her heart the most completely. He spoke as if he were closing a routine business deal, not tearing his own sister and her 2-week-old twins away from the only home she had ever known. Vivian left Millbrook on a gray, drizzling October morning, with 2 infants strapped into a second-hand car seat, $3,000 folded into an envelope in her purse, 1 suitcase of clothes, and a heart so thoroughly broken that she said, years later, she could physically feel it cracking open in her chest as she pulled out of the long gravel driveway for the last time. She drove north with no real destination in mind, just away, until her old sedan finally sputtered and died on the shoulder of a 2-lane highway outside a small town called Hartwell, sitting right on the border between Georgia and South Carolina. It was there, exhausted beyond words, out of money, and unsure how she was going to feed her 2 crying infants, that a diner owner named Loretta Simmons found her sitting in her broken-down car in the gas station parking lot, crying so hard she could barely see straight. And instead of asking a single question, Loretta simply leaned in the window and said, "Come inside, honey. Let's get you and those babies warm and fed, and we will sort the rest out later." Loretta gave Vivian a job washing dishes and waiting tables that very same week, and let her stay, practically for free, in a small 1-bedroom apartment above the diner. It was nothing like the life Vivian had known growing up. There was no big white farmhouse, no company truck with her family's name painted on the door, no last name that opened doors all across town before she even had to speak. There were double shifts on swollen feet that never seemed to stop aching. There were long nights rocking 2 babies to sleep in a cramped apartment with a leaking bathroom faucet that never got properly fixed. There were entire months where Vivian ate nothing but crackers and peanut butter for dinner so that Ethan and Sophie could have proper formula and, later, real food. But there was also, for the very first time in years, something that felt like peace. Nobody in Hartwell had ever heard the name Coleman, and nobody cared. Nobody judged her for being a single mother raising twins on her own. She was simply Vivian, the friendly woman who worked the early morning shift at Loretta's diner and always had a kind word and a warm cup of coffee ready for the regulars. Over the following 10 years, Vivian built a life, brick by brick, the same slow, careful way her father had built his lumber company from a single truck. She enrolled in night classes at the local community college twice a week to formalize her bookkeeping certification, while Loretta happily watched Ethan and Sophie, treating them like grandchildren she never had. Vivian eventually became the diner's full-time bookkeeper, and later, Loretta's official business partner, once Loretta's health began to decline in her early 60s, and she needed a trusted set of hands to help manage what had grown into a small, successful chain of 3 diners spread across 2 neighboring counties. Vivian never remarried, though there were a few good men in Hartwell over the years who tried their best to win her over. She poured nearly everything she had into raising Ethan and Sophie, who grew up polite, hard-working, and for most of their childhood, completely unaware that there was ever a wealthy, prominent side of their family living just a few hours away in Millbrook, Georgia. Ethan grew into a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved taking things apart just to understand how they worked, a trait Vivian always said reminded her achingly of his father, Daniel. Sophie was the louder, more curious twin, always asking questions at the dinner table that Vivian sometimes did not know how to answer. Questions about grandparents she had never met, and a family history that seemed to have a locked door somewhere in the middle of it. Vivian handled these questions with as much honesty as a child could reasonably absorb. She told them, gently, that their mother had come from a family up in Georgia, that there had been a falling out, and that someday, when they were older, she would tell them the whole story. For now, she said, all that mattered was that they had each other. They had Loretta. They had the diner, and they had a home filled with love, even if it wasn't the home she herself had grown up in. Back in Millbrook, Marcus Coleman got exactly what he wanted, at least on paper, and for a long while, it appeared as though his gamble had paid off entirely. He took full control of Coleman Lumber and Supply, aggressively expanded the company into home improvement retail across 4 additional counties, and became, by nearly every visible measure, a very wealthy and very respected man in the state of Georgia. He sat on the local Chamber of Commerce. He donated generously to the new hospital wing in Savannah that eventually had his name engraved on a brass plaque in the main lobby. He was invited to every gala, every fundraising dinner, every ribbon-cutting ceremony in 3 counties, and he always showed up in a tailored suit, with a confident smile, shaking hands and posing for photographs that ran in the local business journal. But the people who knew Marcus Coleman most intimately, his housekeeper of over 15 years, a soft-spoken woman named Dolores, his longtime business partner in the retail expansion, a man named Preston Iverson, and the small handful of childhood friends who still occasionally called him, would later say, quietly and only when asked directly, that Marcus Coleman, for all his outward success, was one of the loneliest men they had ever personally known. He never married, he fathered no children, he kept his house immaculate but empty, and he rarely spoke of his sister to anyone. And on the few occasions her name accidentally came up at a dinner party or a business function, he would change the subject so abruptly and so coldly that people in Millbrook eventually learned, without ever being told directly, not to ask. Dolores, the housekeeper, would later admit to Vivian's aunt that some nights she would find Marcus sitting alone in his father's old study, staring at an old family photograph that included young Vivian, and he would quickly tuck it away into a drawer if he noticed anyone watching, as though he were ashamed of the fact that he still looked at it at all. Then, 10 years almost to the exact month after Vivian left Millbrook with her twins, Marcus Coleman collapsed suddenly in his corner office at Coleman Lumber and Supply headquarters, the victim of a massive heart attack at the age of 52. He was rushed by ambulance to Savannah Memorial Hospital, the very same hospital wing that bore his name on a plaque, but he never regained consciousness, and 3 agonizing days later, surrounded by business partners and board members but not a single family member of his own, Marcus Coleman was gone. This is precisely where the story takes its sharpest turn, because Marcus died without ever having written a will of his own, without a wife, without a single child, and without ever formally amending the original family trust his father had so carefully created decades earlier. And that original trust, the one Nathaniel Coleman had written with such quiet hope for the future of his 2 children, contained a clause that suddenly, overnight, became critically important to hundreds of people who had nothing at all to do with the Coleman family drama. It stated, in plain and unambiguous legal language, that if either of Nathaniel's children died without a will and without having formally settled the terms of their shared trust, full control and distribution of the entire estate, now worth substantially more than it had been 10 years earlier because of Marcus's aggressive business expansion, would revert entirely to the surviving child, or to that surviving child's direct legal descendants. And since Vivian was, as far as anyone remaining in Millbrook actually knew, either dead, missing, or completely unreachable, that meant the entire Coleman estate, the company, the land, the retail locations, the bank accounts, absolutely everything Marcus had spent 10 years building and expanding was now legally frozen solid, unable to be touched, sold, or distributed to a single living soul, until Vivian Coleman herself, or her children, could be located and could formally sign the documents required by law to release it. Harold Ebsen, the very same attorney who had helped Marcus draft the papers that forced Vivian out of Millbrook a decade earlier, now found himself standing in front of a conference room full of increasingly panicked Coleman Lumber executives, explaining, as carefully as he could, that without Vivian or her children, nobody in that room, not the executives, not Marcus's longtime business partner Preston Iverson, not the dozens upon dozens of ordinary working employees whose retirement pensions were tied directly to company shares, could legally access a single dollar of the frozen estate. Bank accounts across 4 counties were locked. The company's planned expansion into a 5th county stalled indefinitely. 312 employees across all of Coleman Lumber's retail and lumberyard locations were informed that their annual profit-sharing distributions, promised faithfully every December for the past decade, could not be processed until further notice. Some of these employees had worked for the company for over 20 years. Some had children starting college that fall who were counting on that December bonus. The board of directors, thoroughly panicked and legally boxed in, hired a private investigator named Curtis Boone to track down Vivian Coleman, wherever in the world she had disappeared to over the past 10 long years. It took Curtis nearly 3 full weeks of patient work to trace Vivian through a stack of old employment records, a decade-old change of address form filed with the post office, and finally, a small feature article in a local South Carolina newspaper about a successful little chain of diners run by 2 women named Loretta Simmons and Vivian Coleman. When Curtis Boone finally knocked on the door of Vivian's modest but genuinely comfortable house on the quiet edge of Hartwell, South Carolina, on a cool Tuesday afternoon in October, almost exactly 10 years to the very day since she had been forced out of Millbrook with nothing, Vivian nearly did not even answer the door, assuming it was simply a door-to-door salesman. When she finally did open it, and Curtis carefully explained who had sent him and precisely why, Vivian later said her hands were shaking so badly that she had to sit straight down on her own front porch steps just to keep from collapsing entirely. The following week, a small, uneasy delegation arrived at Vivian's house in a single rented car. It included Harold Ebsen, visibly aged and clearly uncomfortable in his own skin, a longtime company board member named Rosalind Hayes who had known Vivian since they were both little girls attending the same Sunday school class, and Vivian's own aunt, Carol Whitfield, her late mother's younger sister, who had lost touch with Vivian years earlier after Marcus had made it brutally clear to the entire extended family that Vivian's sudden departure was not, under any circumstances, to be discussed or questioned by anyone who wanted to remain in his good graces. They sat together in Vivian's small but tidy living room, on furniture she had bought piece by careful piece over 10 years of honest hard work, and they laid out the entire desperate situation. Marcus was gone. The estate was completely frozen. 312 families across 4 counties were depending on the company surviving intact, and the only way forward, legally, under the exact terms of Nathaniel Coleman's original trust, was for Vivian, as the sole surviving heir, and her now 10-year-old twins, Ethan and Sophie, as the named beneficiaries written directly into that trust, to travel back to Millbrook and formally sign the paperwork required to release the estate and legally transfer control before more damage was done. Vivian sat quietly for a long, heavy moment before she finally spoke. She said she remembered, with perfect clarity, exactly what this same family had told her 10 years earlier, that she was an embarrassment, that she needed to simply disappear for the good of the sacred Coleman name, that if she caused any trouble whatsoever, she would deeply regret it for the rest of her life. And now, she said, looking around at the faces sitting in her small living room, this same family was here, needing her signature and her children's signatures to save the very company that had thrown all 3 of them away without so much as a second thought. Harold Ebsen, to his credit, did not try to defend or minimize what had happened all those years ago. He simply admitted in a quiet, tired voice that what Marcus had done to her was deeply wrong, and that he himself had gone along with drafting those papers because Marcus was paying his law firm's bills at the time, and because he had told himself, back then, that it was simply family business that was not really his place to judge one way or the other. He said he had thought about that decision many, many times over the intervening years, especially as he watched Marcus grow more and more isolated with each passing year, and he suspected, though he never said it out loud to Marcus directly, that some quiet part of Marcus had always known what he had done was unforgivable, and that the crushing loneliness Marcus lived with for an entire decade might have been, in its own strange way, its own private punishment. Vivian's Aunt Carol reached across the small coffee table and took her niece's hand in both of hers, and told her, through tears she could no longer hold back, that she had tried more than once over the years to track Vivian down, but that Marcus had made it painfully clear that anyone in the extended family who helped Vivian, or even spoke her name aloud at a family gathering, would be permanently cut off from the rest of the family, and, more importantly to Marcus, from any future share of the family business. Carol, who had 2 young children of her own to think about and provide for at the time, admitted with deep shame that she had let her own fear keep her silent for far too long. She apologized, tearfully and repeatedly, and told Vivian that not a single day had gone by in 10 years that she hadn't thought about her sister's daughter, and about the 2 babies she had never once gotten the chance to hold or meet. For nearly 2 full weeks, Vivian wrestled privately with what she should do. Part of her wanted absolutely nothing to do with Millbrook ever again. Nothing to do with the Coleman name. Nothing to do with any of the people who had let her walk away with 2 newborns and never once come looking for her. She had built a genuinely good life in Hartwell, brick by brick, with her own 2 hands. Ethan and Sophie were happy, thriving in their small-town school, surrounded by neighbors and friends who loved them for exactly who they were, not for what last name they happened to carry. But Vivian was also, at her core, a practical bookkeeper who understood numbers and consequences better than almost anyone, and she could not stop thinking about something the board members had mentioned, almost as an afterthought during that first difficult conversation, that 312 ordinary families, people with mortgages and car payments and children of their own heading off to college, were depending entirely on that company staying financially afloat. She thought back to herself, 10 years earlier, alone with 2 crying infants and $3,000 to her name, and she could not bring herself to be the reason so many more families ended up in that exact same terrifying position, even if the man who had put her there in the first place was the very same man who had built the trap that now threatened all of them. So Vivian finally made her decision, but she made it firmly on her own terms, refusing to be rushed or pressured the way she had been rushed and pressured a decade earlier. She agreed to travel to Millbrook, but only after insisting on 3 non-negotiable conditions before she would sign a single piece of paper. First, she demanded that the complete, unedited truth of what Marcus had done to her 10 years earlier be formally entered into the permanent written record of the trust's history, so that no future generation of the family could ever again quietly bury or rewrite what had truly happened to her. Second, she required that a substantial portion of the estate, a portion Marcus had never once intended to share with anyone outside his own personal control, be permanently set aside as a protected fund, guaranteeing every single employee's pension and profit-sharing distribution, regardless of who sat on the company's board of directors in future years. And third, and most important of all to Vivian personally, she insisted that her children, Ethan and Sophie, would never, under any circumstances, be pressured, now or at any point in the future, to take on the Coleman name or the family business, unless it was something they genuinely wanted for themselves, on their own timeline, once they were old enough to make that decision with full understanding and free will. The board, thoroughly desperate and completely out of legal options, agreed in writing to all 3 of Vivian's conditions within a single week. When Vivian finally drove back into Millbrook, Georgia, for the first time in a full decade, with Ethan and Sophie sitting in the back seat asking curious questions about the small town their mother had grown up in, she said afterward that the strangest feeling washing over her was not anger and was not sadness either, but rather a kind of quiet, settled strength she had genuinely not expected to feel. She parked her car outside the old Coleman Lumber and Supply headquarters, the very same building her father had built up from nothing more than a single delivery truck decades earlier, and she walked inside not as the frightened, grieving woman who had once been thrown out in shame, but as the mother who had survived everything thrown at her, and whose 2 10-year-old children now, quite literally, held the entire future of that company resting gently in their small hands. The formal signing of the documents took place in a large conference room filled with lawyers, board members, and a small handful of longtime company employees who had specifically requested to be present that day, several of whom still remembered young Vivian from childhood and had never once believed the quiet, poisonous stories Marcus used to spread about her over the years. Ethan and Sophie, solemn-faced and understandably a little overwhelmed by the crowd of adults watching their every move. Each carefully signed their names on the line, printed just beneath their mother's signature, and just like that, the 10-year freeze on the entire estate was formally lifted. Delayed paychecks were immediately released. Frozen pensions were permanently secured under the new protective fund, and the company, along with the 312 ordinary families depending on it for their livelihood, would survive intact. But Vivian's story did not simply end there in that quiet conference room, and this is the part of her story that people in Millbrook still talk about warmly to this very day. Vivian did not just sign the necessary papers and immediately disappear back to Hartwell, satisfied that her legal obligations had been met. She used a meaningful portion of her own newly restored share of the estate, combined with the tremendous goodwill she had earned through the calm, dignified way she had handled the entire painful situation, to establish a permanent scholarship fund named in honor of her late father Nathaniel, specifically designed for single mothers throughout Millbrook and the surrounding counties who wanted to pursue higher education or vocational training while raising children entirely on their own, just as she had once been forced to do. She told the local newspaper, in the only public interview she ever agreed to give about her ordeal, that she wanted something genuinely good to come out of the very worst chapter of her entire life, and that if her story could help even one young struggling mother feel a little less alone during a moment when the whole world seemed to be silently judging her, then everything she had personally survived would have truly meant something in the end. Ethan and Sophie grew up knowing the complete, honest truth of their family's complicated history, not as some shameful secret whispered behind closed doors at family gatherings, but as an open, plainly stated lesson their mother taught them directly at the kitchen table. That family is never truly about a name printed on a company letterhead or a fortune sitting quietly in a bank account, but is instead about who genuinely shows up for you when you have absolutely nothing left to offer them, and who consistently chooses love over pride when it matters the very most. Vivian never fully moved back to Millbrook to live permanently, choosing instead to keep her home and her thriving diner business in Hartwell, the small town that had generously taken her in when her own blood family had so coldly cast her out. But she did make genuine peace with her painful past. She visited her father's grave regularly whenever she came through Millbrook on business related to the scholarship fund. She fully reconciled with her Aunt Carol, who now visits Ethan and Sophie every single summer without fail. And she made absolutely certain, through the terms she had negotiated, that the company her father had spent his entire life building would continue faithfully providing for the same community he had always genuinely cared about. As for Marcus, Vivian never once spoke publicly with bitterness about her own brother, not even after everything that had happened between them. In private conversations with her closest friends back in Hartwell, she said only that she believed Marcus had spent his final decade of life wealthier than almost anyone else in the entire state of Georgia, and yet more thoroughly alone than almost anyone she had ever personally known, and that there was a quiet, important lesson buried somewhere in that painful contradiction, whether Marcus himself had ever truly understood it before he passed away or not. There is something in this story genuinely worth sitting with for a while, no matter what your own family happens to look like today. Greed has a peculiar way of convincing us that we are simply protecting something precious, our family name, our hard-earned legacy, our personal comfort, when in reality, we are only protecting our own stubborn pride at the direct expense of the very people who love us the most in this world. Marcus Coleman spent 10 long years building an impressive business empire, and he ultimately died without a single person who truly loved him standing quietly beside his hospital bed. Vivian Coleman, meanwhile, was left with absolutely nothing but 2 newborn babies and $3,000 to her name, and she went on to build a life so genuinely full of love and hard-earned peace that when the very family who had once abandoned her came crawling desperately back 10 years later, she found within herself the strength not for petty revenge, but for grace, in every possible meaning of that word. If you happen to have family members you have grown distant from over the years because of money or old wounds or stubborn pride that never quite healed properly, please consider this a gentle reminder today that life is genuinely short, and the people who reliably show up for you during your very hardest moments are worth so much more than any inheritance could ever be. And if you happen to be the one who has been unfairly, unkindly cast aside by people who were supposed to love and protect you, take real heart in Vivian's story today. Because sometimes, the very thing that was cruelly meant to break you completely becomes, in time, the exact thing that makes you unshakable for the rest of your life. If this story genuinely moved you today, please do me a quick favor and hit that like button before you go. Drop a comment down below letting me know which part of Vivian's long journey stuck with you the most. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please join our growing community right now so that you never miss the very next story we share. We post brand new videos just like this one every single day, and there is so much more where this particular story came from. Thank you so very much for spending this time with me today, and I will see you again in the very next one.
Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and support me. Thank you so much. I love you all. Bye!